Welcome to Repros Fight Back, a podcast on all things repro. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and each episode I will be taking you to the front lines of the escalating fight over our sexual and reproductive health and rights at home and abroad. Each episode I will be speaking with leaders who are fighting to protect our reproductive health and rights, to ensure that no one's reproductive health depends on where they live. It's time for Repros to fight back. Welcome to Repros Fight Back. This week's episode, we're going to tackle one of the most prevalent human rights violations in the world, gender-based violence. Worldwide, 1 in 3 women will experience physical or sexual abuse in their lifetime. Helping me dig into this weighty topic, I'm excited to have my friend, Tara DeMont, from Amnesty International here to talk to me today. Welcome, Tara. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning by unpacking what I think can be kind of a complicated question is, what do we mean when we say gender-based violence? It can cover a whole range of things, so I think it's worth taking a couple minutes to be like, what do we mean when we say gender-based violence?
Yeah, so gender-based violence, or you might see GBV, is violence that's committed against someone because of their perceived sex or their actual sex or their gender or perceived gender. What traditionally that has meant is violence against women and girls, but it's important to recognize that gender-based violence is also committed against LGBTQ people, gender nonconforming people, and even men and boys. The reality is, though, that 1 in 3 women or girls will experience violence in her lifetime, and so GBV has become a blanket term for understanding violence against women and girls.
Yeah, absolutely. But we always need to remember that it is broader when we talk about that. So let's talk a little bit about what does this look like right now around the world?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a staggering global picture, and I think that that's one of the reasons that when we talk about violence against women and girls, GBV gets brought into that. Again, it's really important we don't erase gender nonconforming people, LGBTQ people, but globally what we're seeing is an incredible level of violence against women and girls, without exception, and including in our own country. And that looks different and the same depending on where you are. The things that are the same is that this type of violence comes from structural imbalances of power, where women and girls lack institutional and cultural power, access to the same decision-making mechanisms, access, whether that's in government or in their own homes and situations, where they lack access to the same opportunities, where they lack the same rights, where they lack the same protections. And those are the things that are the same no matter what that specific type of violence looks like. And that violence takes on many forms, and that can be intimate partner violence or domestic violence. That can be so-called dowry violence. I mean, there's just no end, unfortunately, to the amounts of specific types of violence. One of the really important things when thinking about gender-based violence, violence against women and girls globally, is that, you know, there are some types of violence that we think of as being more violent, more horrific. And a lot of that time, that's because it's exoticized violence. And so when we as a human rights organization are talking about GBV, it's critical to know that it's the same violence, and it comes from that same place of imbalance and power imbalance, whether or not it's the type of violence we see in our own communities here in DC or wherever we live, or if it's a very specific type of violence.
Yeah, I think that's really important to think about because not all violence is physical violence, and within that frame of GBV as well.
Yeah, that's particularly important for intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And our colleagues globally, and certainly here in the United States, would remind us that, you know, violence is not always only physical either, and that can be power and control and psychological violence and controlling people's movements, fear and threats of harm, or controlling money, and controlling mobility, controlling children or people they care for, etc. And that, again, like that's violence we see everywhere. And because there tends to be a hierarchy of violence that people think of as more or less important, what we miss is that it comes from, again, that same root cause, which is the imbalance of power and the imbalance of equal access to rights. It also means then that women and girls and other people who experience non-physical violence are often even more invisible in that work because there aren't the same types of reporting mechanisms, whether, again, here in the U.S. or anywhere else, where it doesn't signal in the same way maybe to lawmakers or to police or to other types of officials as serious violence. One example of that is online violence and harassment. And actually, Amnesty International is about to launch a report on March 21st about online violence against women, including trans women and gender nonconforming people, and the types of violence, psychological violence, that people are subjected to online. And there's very little oversight or recourse for people. And police don't take it seriously. Certainly laws don't take it seriously. But the effects of psychological violence are really present, and they are really real. And that's, again, part of the spectrum of violence that we see globally.
Well, I think it plays into another thing, which is it's often a silent crime or incident. You don't hear a lot about it. The victims are silenced. And talking about online violence, it's a way of silencing people to keep them from talking.
No, that's exactly right. And of course, there's an extremely clear gendered component to violence online. Anyone can experience violence online. But what we have seen in our research, and what many other folks who work on this have seen, is that women and girls and gender nonconforming people are specifically targeted because of their sex or gender or perceived sex or gender and speaking out in places. And so it's another way in which particularly women and girls are silenced, which is a continuum of what we've seen across history in our own moment, in our own country, and globally. Again, women being silenced, and online violence is just a way that you do that in an incredibly accessible, incredibly open access way. There's no escaping from that, right? Because the internet is everywhere, and there's very few people who can do their own jobs without the internet or some sort of online presence. But also it's a way of connecting with the world and information. And so if you are silencing yourself, if you're self-censoring because you're afraid of violence, it's part of that continuum of violence. But because it's in an online space, right, it's not seen as legitimate. And because it's psychological violence, it's not seen as legitimate. And I think that's a challenge for us in the community of working on GBV, on violence against women and girls particularly, to make sure that we're seeing the spectrum of violence and all these, so that we are not further making invisible survivors of this type of violence, because we focus on particularly abhorrent examples, or physical violence specifically, or violence in war context. And all those are incredibly serious issues, and we need to spend time on them. But making sure that we see this issue holistically means addressing its root causes, which is power imbalance, which is women and girls and gender nonconforming people not having access to their spectrum of rights, including reproductive rights. Those are the issues that are at the root of those things. And if we address violence against women and girls piecemeal, we're never going to get at overturning the root causes.
Right, and that brings us to a great way of starting to talk about what can be done. How can we address these root causes, or what is being done to address some of these issues?
Yeah, so, I mean, some of your guests that you've already had who do incredible reproductive rights work and GBV work, you know, there's so many ways to address GBV, violence against women and girls specifically. You know, for us, one of our main focus here in D.C. as Amnesty International is making sure that the United States, in policy, particularly in its policy abroad, thinks about how to address adequately gender-based violence, whether that's through our work with the State Department, through USAID, through things like the GBV strategy, which is the gender-based violence strategy, which helps the U.S. think holistically about these issues. Right? That's one way, is making sure governments, for example, our own government, in everything that they do, prioritizes ending violence against women and girls globally. What we've seen is when that's not part of a country's priority list, when it's not integrated into the work they do, or when it's seen as a siloed issue, a sort of separate issue, something maybe they're like, yes, it's a serious human rights concern, but of course it's totally different than economic, you know, growth or whatever.
Or these people over here are working on it, so it doesn't impact my education work or whatever.
And what, of course, we've seen is not only is that not true, that gender-based violence is central to all those pieces of work, but it means that those types of projects that don't include that are less effective, because when women and girls cannot live free from violence or the threat of violence, they are not able to access their rights in other ways. And whether that is a development project like accessing water or education, or whether it is interacting with government power or even participating in power structures like that, if people cannot live free from violence or the threat of violence or the fear of violence, they can't access those other rights. So not only is it just a good thing holistically to think about so we all feel better about each other, but it actually means our projects that are quote unquote different or unconnected don't work as well because they are connected. So, so one thing like what can be done about it is governments can make ending GBV, ending violence against women and girls specifically, the top of their priority list. Not only will it address that, this is a human rights crisis. Like, not only will it address that human rights crisis and scandal, but it will make sure all the other work that a government is doing is much more effective. Because if you don't address GBV, you aren't fully addressing whatever quote unquote other issue you're dealing with.
Well, yeah, because it touches so many things. So we're talking about the imbalance of power, and it affects so many different things, whether it's keeping girls out of school or marrying young or all these other things that are going to have health implications or future education implications. And it'll be hard to achieve other goals. So it's really important to see how so many of these different topics that seem unrelated at first glance are actually really interrelated.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the primary lessons of GBV advocacy, right? For those of us who work in women's rights, particularly, is making sure that we see things holistically. If we are siloed, if we work in these very separated spheres of work and influence trying to achieve, very contained goals, that makes sense in terms of resources and how we're trying to achieve something that we can put down on paper, and I get that. But it means that actually we're not actually achieving, right? Like if I achieve a very specific goal, but it's not taking into account the holistic person and or the other rights implications, it's not going to work. And that's a lesson from gender-based violence that I think we need to do better in the GBV field, but also across rights and access. And, nowhere is that clearer than in reproductive rights and gender-based violence, right? So if we do not address reproductive rights within gender-based violence, if they are fully divorced, it will not be effective. Right, our work to end gender-based violence, because reproductive rights are central to that. And if, of course, in our work on reproductive rights, we don't address gender-based violence, we're not going to do the job. It's not going to get us there, because gender-based violence is central to ensuring that people, particularly women and girls, have access to their full rights, their full reproductive rights.
So a lot of things changed in D.C. when the Trump administration came. I know it's touched on a lot of different issues. So how has that affected work around gender-based violence?
A lot has changed in the United States' official approach to human rights in general, and to gender-based violence specifically, and of course to reproductive rights. And most of those changes have not been positive. For example, in this administration, we've seen multiple very clear examples of explicit attacks on reproductive rights and on women's rights, and not just sort of half-cooked ideas that didn't quite get it holistically, right? There's no administration has ever been perfect on these issues, but this administration has had very clear, very explicit attacks on trying to whittle down rights. And that comes from what seems to be a concerted effort to redefine what women's rights are, right? I don't think that there's a person, at least officially speaking for the administration, that would say that that the U.S. government does not believe in women's rights. And in fact, they would say that they champion women's rights, but they're trying to redefine what that is. And that is really dangerous, not only for the millions of women that affects in the United States and outside the United States because of the influence of U.S. foreign policy and the government, but because it looks to shift our very understanding of the work that we do. There's so many examples, it's hard to choose one. But I think a good lesson learner is one that at first, again, we might think of as unrelated, which is the question of the travel ban and the administration's attack on Muslim-majority countries. And, at first one might see that and say, like, this is a clear attack on Muslim majority countries, which it very much is, and that might be the end of the conversation. But again, if we're not thinking of this holistically, if we don't see this as a women's rights issue, if we don't see it as a reproductive rights issue, if we don't see it as a question of violence against women and girls, we're really missing something. And that, not only does that fly in the face of multiple human rights laws, treaties, and standards around racial and ethnic discrimination, but also has severe implications for gender-based violence. I think which is people who are trying to seek asylum because of violence,
right.
Gender-based violence, people who are trying to do work to end gender-based violence and lose the access and or the types of resources that they could have gotten before, and of course just the signal it sends throughout the world. On the flip side, right, if the community, if the gender community does not address these issues as gender issues, we also miss an opportunity to say, hey, like, this isn't just, quote unquote, an issue of diversity, an issue of fairness, an issue of U.S. values, an issue of Islamophobia. This is also central to who we are as the gender community. You know, so for example, in the administration's defense of why they needed to close down travel to these Muslim-majority countries, they listed at least two instances of why, because of gender-based violence. This is why we can't let these people into the country, right? And what that does, like, of course there's gender-based violence in Muslim-majority countries. There's gender-based violence
everywhere.
In Christian-majority countries, right? But what that does is it otherizes violence against women and girls, saying it's, oh, well, this is these other people's problem, right? Not us, because we're not a Muslim-majority country. That's not the same. And of course, like, it further feeds Islamophobia, that, like, one of the visions that the administration has put out there of Muslim-majority countries and Islam is as being an anti-woman religion. You know, these types of, other than just being inaccurate, like documentedly inaccurate, divide communities, advocacy communities. And so what you then have are people who are all trying to make sure we have our rights, all rights-based communities being pitted against each other. And I think that there's so many opportunities in which advocacy communities could have taken the bait, right? To say, like, you're right, there is violence against women in X number of countries. Let's close down the borders. But, you know, thankfully, the gender community is smarter than that, which is like, no, closing down the borders, not only is this excuse of yours, we can see through this excuse of yours, like, you do not have permission to use violence against women and girls as your excuse for being Islamophobic. But in doing this, it actually has severe consequences for ending violence against women and girls, which is one of the reasons you say that you're putting it in there. That's the same with the border wall, right? Which is beefing up border security, partly because the justification of the administration was partly because of cartel violence against women and girls. And there is documented cartel violence against women and girls. But this idea that first of all, that's the only place that violence happens against women and girls, or that's somehow more important violence against women and girls than other places, or that a shutdown of U.S. government approach is going to address that, I think is really dangerous. And that's a really long-winded answer to say that, you know, there are so many examples where the president has explicitly tweeted or made statements that are in contrast with long-held standards of women's rights and reproductive rights and the rights of all people. But then there are these more, I think, insidious examples where you see the administration trying to chip away at select people's rights in an effort to divide the advocacy community. And again, I think that for those of us in the gender community and gender-based violence particularly, like, we cannot take that bait and need to lead the charge to make sure that we're all standing together. Now, that doesn't mean we all have 100% more energy to do, 50 more things every day.
Right.
But it does mean that we recognize that our rights and our success is tied together, and that the uplift that we're looking for women and girls to end gender-based violence is tied directly to those people who are trying to make sure Islamophobia doesn't flourish more throughout this country, those people who are trying to make sure anti-immigrant sentiment doesn't flourish throughout this country and become law and practice and policy. There are also just really specific direct attacks on reproductive rights by this administration globally through the reinstitution of the Mexico City policy, through the global gag rule, through redefining what gender means and how they use that word throughout the State Department, throughout the administration, through, of course, the attacks that have happened here nationally by trying to shut down funding to reproductive health organizations, trying to ensure that poor women, particularly, and women of color, don't have the same access that rich women have to reproductive rights, access, and health. Those are all really, really there's just so many examples, it's hard to choose
Yeah.
from them. But again, I think the lesson is that particularly in the gender-based violence community, that while we should be strategic in how we think about moving forward and how we're going to invest our efforts, that we cannot see any of these as not related to our work, because that is how not only will we lose, but everyone will lose.
Trying to peel the communities off,
Yeah.
make everyone fight for their own thing and not fight together. And I think another thing that has been particularly striking, I think, in this area with the Trump administration is the Obama administration was such strong champions of human rights in general, and the Trump administration has really stepped back from that global leadership in support of human rights. And that's troubling.
Certainly Amnesty International had many examples of where the
Right.
Obama administration could have done better with human rights, and this administration has made very clear that it is not committed to the same standard of human rights, even in policy, if not in practice, as previous administrations. And where the types of rollbacks we've seen are they're almost unthinkable. They're moving so quickly and they're so vast, right? Again, this is not we happen to disagree on this one policy point, and good people can disagree on whether or not this right extends here or that right extends here, right? It is a full rollback of a country's well-being being tied to a commitment to human rights. And that you can see at every level. And whether that is the United States participation and statements at the United Nations, the United States, obviously its travel bans and who it will allow to come in the country or seek to forfeit rights to inside the country, that is a wholesale attack on human rights. And again, it is enough that it is an attack on a specific right and a specific group. It is enough that it is an attack on women. It is enough that it is an attack on reproductive rights. It is enough that it is an attack on people of certain faiths. But more than that, it is an attack on the very commitment to a rights-based society. And I think that should scare us on a level that individual attacks sometimes can just be moving so quickly that we're trying to deal with,
right.
Every fire, putting out every fire. But this wholesale sort of pull back from the idea that we are a rights-based society and that all rights apply to all people. And that broader picture, I think, is so much darker and so much scarier than the individual, even the very scary, very dark individual attacks show, that, we're going to lose the forest for the trees if we don't see this as what it is, which is a concerted, focused, specific, and very, very explicit pullback from human rights as a general concept.
That's dark.
It is dark. And I think, I think it's dark. And it's important that we start with that recognition so that we then are ready to move forward. And again, as I was saying before, it's not that now we all have 100 extra hours a week and we're all going to be able to ride on every horse, but that we see it for what it is and we strategize accordingly. And I think that what that means, and sometimes what it means is more meetings and making sure that people are looped in sort of, annoying communication ways. But I think what it also means is making very clear that we're actually seeing the problem, which to tie back to GBV, the problem is not this type of violence that is somehow different than the community violence I see. It is this broader problem of women being unequal to men. And here again, there are very specific attacks on communities that we need to address and that are very serious. And it is the broader problem of the United States retreating from commitments to human rights. And if that problem doesn't get addressed, if we don't see these individual attacks as part of that, we're never going to get at that root cause.
So we talked a little bit earlier about how GBV and sexual and reproductive health and rights need to work together and how they do work together. So let's talk a little bit about why that's important.
There's so many reasons why it's important, both like theoretical reasons and moral reasons. But ultimately, if you just want to be efficient, you cannot do one without the other, right? And any type of rights work that doesn't include all rights is not rights work. And that doesn't mean that every org does everything, but that we recognize that as organizations committed to rights, whether they're reproductive rights or maybe they're LGBTQ rights or they're the rights of immigrants, that all those things work together and that people are holistic, right? So that I, as a cis woman, experience my rights all the same time. I don't experience them as a woman today and as an American tomorrow and as, someone of X heritage the next day. So just to make sure our work actually works, there's some sort of like logical loop that it's so confusing when people want to sort of cherry pick who gets what rights, where you're just like, well, that's not even just rights work. That doesn't work. But ultimately, we do that because at Amnesty we've seen, when you exclude rights from that narrative, when people do not have full access to the full spectrum of their rights, they're not able to enjoy that specific right you really care about. Mm-hmm. And some people are really passionate about the right to participate in one's government. And some people are really passionate about reproductive rights. And some people are really passionate about the rights of LGBTQ people. And that's great, right? Like, you should be driven by your passion and the change you want to see in the world. And when we are focused so closely in on one thing, we don't see that they're tied to each other. Our work on reproductive rights, our work on the right to access water, whatever it is, won't be effective. So again, there's that really base, like, well, if you want your work to work, you definitely have to see it in that broader picture, right?
Right. And again, it's all just so interrelated and affects each other.
Yeah, I think, one really good example, and we have folks that, Amnesty International is a grassroots organization, and that means that we have a multi-million person membership, and these are people from all walks of life, and they do all sorts of things, and they are interested in all sorts of issues. And again, they might care about one thing a lot and are happy to support the other things, or they might just really care about this one thing. One of the really helpful examples that I'm working with some members and with who really, really cared about the right to education, particularly for girl children. And we're really invested in some of our work in Western Africa in that region, on that issue on access to education for girls. And that's great. I want more people to care about access to education for girl children. And I was trying to explain to them why our work in the same region with the same groups on access to reproductive health was related, and they weren't opposed to reproductive rights, but they were saying, no, but what I really care about is the girls in school. And it's like, great, 100%. Every child has the right to education. That is a basic human right. And every child, every person has basic reproductive rights. And let me tell you why they're related. Because if a girl cannot go to school because she is menstruating and there's no safe place for her to deal with the issues of her body, she doesn't get her education. So her right to education is directly tied to her right to water and sanitation, to her right to reproductive information, fact-based information, to her right to resources and access that helps her actually deal with the reality of her body. Or if a child gets pregnant, because there is no access to birth control, because there is no access to information about how one gets pregnant, then she's not going to be able to fulfill that right to education. And it was, for these people I was working with, it was this sort of like, oh yeah, moment. Like, it makes total sense, right? Yeah. And so, like, there's an issue where, you have so many people who are passionate about issues, particularly around the rights of women and girls, right? There are a lot of people who want to see things be better and who want to see us in a more gender-just world, who we just have to make sure that we are working together and helping people see those connections. Now, it doesn't mean that, again, everyone has more time, but it does mean that the approach that we take to education would be holistic, or the approach we take to reproductive rights would be holistic and include education.
Or they want to do the non-sticky stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's easy to say that you want to invest in girls' education, but, reproductive rights, that just complicates things. Let's keep it separate.
No, because it's icky and political, right? And I think that, one of the lessons for us as a global rights organization, one of the lessons for all of us as reproductive rights advocates, and for us as human rights advocates or who work with issues of women and girls, there are issues that sell better than others. And there are issues that are more palatable than others. And, until we topple the patriarchy, which is coming, so brace yourself. But until we get there, like, we live in a political reality where reproductive rights are politicized, and where people find questions of sex and reproduction icky, and they don't want to deal with it. That's the reality we live in, and we have to strategize on that, and we can't reinforce that. Right? That is reality. We have to deal with it.
It doesn't change the reality that those things intersect and work together.
Yeah, and we can't reinforce narratives which carve out women and girls, the rights of women and girls, away from reproductive rights, away from sexual rights. Now, we can plan, we can be strategic about how we're trying to make gains and push everything along, right? But we can't carve those things out, and we can't separate those things. Now, again, not only because it is not how people experience their rights, and I would say the wrong thing to do, but also because it won't work if we try and do, quote unquote, just our women and girls work, and we're not going to deal with reproductive rights because it's too sticky, it's too political. We're not going to succeed in our women and girls' rights work. But it can be hard because we live in such a time where rights in general are deeply politicized, which I find mind-boggling, but particularly sexual and reproductive rights. And I think that becomes the metaphor is terrible, but the elephant in the room where everyone knows when we're talking about, well, it's difficult to work on all rights. Like, we're really talking about sexual and reproductive rights, right, because they are so deeply politicized. And there are other examples, the rights of people in poverty, the rights of sex workers, things that people just, it's so political and so difficult and very tricky. Those things are all true. It is incredibly tricky. It is very difficult, and it is extremely politicized.
But still really
really has to be worked on, and it can't be excised from our overall approach and our strategy, right? And I think is a danger in the community. I mean, forget about the dangers from without, which are numerous, but the danger from within our communities is wanting to be effective, wanting to do what we think is right, and working for people's rights, and in doing so, reestablishing hierarchies of rights, reestablishing narratives that silo rights apart from each other. And we'll lose in the long run if we do that. Maybe we'll win something in the short term, right? And there's something very seductive about that, because we all, those of us who work in advocacy for women and girls, who work in advocacy for gender, who work in advocacy for reproductive rights, we do this, for the huge paychecks. No, we do this because we really care and we really want to make progress in the lives of people. Like, we are, maybe there's an exception, but most people I know are motivated because they want to do good and they want to do more good. And that is a good motivation, and sometimes you can lose sight that because you can see this light at the end of this one tunnel to try and make this, this effort happen, that we'll lose in the long run if we do that. And it's certainly like I'm, casting stones in my own glass house as I think about our own strategies and approaches as a human rights organization and what we've uplifted and what we've chosen not to uplift, and partly make strategies on what you can win and what you want to push forward, and partly because it's easy to lose sight that, like, as my father would say, you rob Peter to pay Paul. You win one place while you're actually sort of losing the sort of overall battle.
Well, I think that brings us to the news that leaked late last month about the State Department making some edits to their annual human rights report. And there were some proposed changes that get right at this area we were talking about of chipping away at rights and not wanting to talk about some of them.
Yeah, and late last month is only last week, right?
I know.
It sounds so far away. So the time is so slow these days. So there was a Politico report and then a Post report, I think, came out afterwards about the State Department cutting away, chipping away, or editing, depending on who you talk to, sections of its human rights report. So, as folks will know, that the State Department puts out an annual human rights report, sort of overview of human rights globally, and then puts out a parallel report on trafficking in people, trafficking in persons. And those reports cover all countries, and they are supposed to be overviews of complex human rights pictures that help guide United States policy strategy and interactions in human rights focus, right? What the Politico report noted was that, and there had been some leaks in the State Department, but that there were proposed changes to Section 6, which you might not have memorized, is the section on discrimination. And that includes women and girls, it includes LGBTI people, and it includes sexual and reproductive rights. And then I think the last subsection is just discrimination in general. And that there had been a push from the Secretary's office to pare that section down. So, there has been a statement out from the State Department saying, well, look, it's not politically motivated. It's really just to make this report easier to read and more focused on the actual violations instead of the context. And I'm not a palm reader or a mind reader, and I can't tell you what's in the hearts and minds of people who make decisions. But I think what's much less important than the intent is the reality of what that means. So whether or not it is to make the report more pared down, and it is sometimes can be a monster report, right. Or if it is because there's an ideological drive, the result is the same, which is if we excise the context, which seems like is what, now we haven't seen the report, but right. If that is what's happening, which it seems like that's what's going to happen, is taking out a lot of context and just sort of getting to instead the like, is this law, is LGBTI behavior criminalized or existence criminalized? Yes, no, right? Without that cultural context and maybe linking to that context, that is the same effect as if it was actually politically motivated. So to me, the question of motivation, it certainly matters, but ultimately I think the effect is what is most important here. So, these reports have been effective for human rights defenders globally. Like, we know that as Amnesty International. Like, we put out human rights reports too.
Which also just came out.
And I'm happy to talk more about. Certainly, like, we put out reports too, and we know that human rights defenders use our reports, they use Human Rights Watch's reports, they use lots of people's reports, and they use the U.S. State Department report in their own advocacy with their own government to say, like, look, the U.S. government has called you out on these things. And it gives not only that opportunity for advocacy and change, but also protection to human rights defenders globally. And it's able to do that not because the United States is a shining beacon of human rights, but because it has been seen as an objective report that details out human rights problems and issues. And if instead this report is seen as an ideological document, if it is seen as, if it doesn't have that context, if it loses the sort of richness and that research, it's not a useful tool. Then what it is a database of laws. So that in and of itself is troubling. The other part that I find, there's so many troubling things, so I don't know if I'd say equally or more troubling, is the change of one of the section titles. So under the last administration and the Obama administration, that the section title had been changed to reproductive rights, to think about that more holistically. The mandate from Congress of these are reports mandated from Congress, and the mandate from Congress is specific to questions of forced abortion and there's one other subsection that I'm forgetting, but don't think about the issue holistically. But that's the minimum standard, right? Congress says at a minimum, you must report to us on forced sterilization. There it is, forced abortion.
There we go.
And those are human rights violations, 100%. And we should 100% be reporting on those, right? But what previous versions of this report realized under different State Departments in the Obama administration was if you're also not reporting on access to reproductive health care, on access to contraception, on access to safe, decriminalized legal abortion services, you have an incomplete picture. Like we can tell you the number of forced abortions in X country or the laws, whatever it is, but that's not actually going to help end that if we don't think about this issue holistically, if we don't actually think about rights holistically. So here again is an example of where if we don't think about these rights, even within the same umbrella of rights, forced abortion, forced sterilization, access to abortion, access to reproductive health care, that, that work's not going to be accurate, it's not going to be effective. That is also, though, I think a very specific place where we see a very troubling trend of the administration making very clear its understanding of reproductive rights and what that means and who those rights are for and what the ideology is behind that, right? This is not the scoop of the century to tell you that this administration does not believe or support the right to access abortion, does not believe or support in equal access to reproductive care, in birth control. Like those are policies that are being rolled out, right? So that's not a shock. That's not a shock. But in doing that in the human rights reporting, what you're trying to do is change the standards. You're trying to change the names. And, the defense of the State Department has been like, well, this is what Congress mandated is forced sterilization, forced abortion. And that is true. That is a fact of history that you can look up on record to see what was required, right? But what the change of that section in the past to be more inclusive, not to be less inclusive, really signaled was an understanding that our rights are inseparable and that reproductive rights are central to a person's full enjoyment of their human rights. And by that specific, now all the stuff they're going to cut, whatever we're going to see, there's going to be a lot of implications, but that specific implication is very clear, which is to say reproductive rights are not human rights. Right. The United States does not believe, nor does it support reproductive rights as human rights. And again, not the scoop of the century. We've seen that in the global gag, we've seen that in U.S. policies, we've seen that in the president's and vice president's very words and in many of Congress's very words. But that major shift, I think, is very troubling and something that we need to raise Cain about. And I think it can be, for those particularly outside D.C., I always think of it as like my mom test. Like, could I explain this to my mother? who's very woke and very into the work, but not always that into DC, right? Like,
right. No, I have the same thing. Like
in the hills of California, will my mother understand what's going on? And so I understand that, like, these types of issues, like who's a nominee for what position, or, you know, is the State Department doing X subsection 12 on what
Yes.
data? That can seem very, it can seem very DC, frankly. But the reason that matters is not because we want longer reports, because God save us, we don't.
Right.
But because it signals a very clear official position that reproductive rights are not human rights, and that is the signal coming from the State Department. It's certainly coming from Congress. It's coming from the president. It is the vice president's tattoo, I would imagine.
I would
if he had
assume
any.
so.
I'm sure that he doesn't, because I'm sure they're sinful. But, you know, that we know this is true of those individuals. We know this is true of their agendas. And now it is official State Department agenda, and that is very troubling. So, you know, we'll see how much gets excised in the actual report when it comes out. We also have no idea when it's coming out.
Right.
I think another thing that's very troubling is the process and rule of law questions. Like, how does government work? Like, is government, again, we have disagreed with administrations in the past. Amnesty has never fully agreed with administrations, right? No administration has a perfect human rights record. But we all depended on government working like government and going through certain processes. And we might then fight it out in terms of, do we agree X, do we agree Y? We have different perspectives on how rights should be implemented or what is right. Like, previous administrations have not understood
Right.
reproductive rights as important, right? This is not new. This sort of level and viciousness it seems a little new. But, you know, this broader rollback of how just governance works, I think is equally troubling for us here in the United States, because we at Amnesty have seen this in other places as as governance erodes, right? Like, all rights are certainly at risk, and the first ones are reproductive rights, the rights of LGBTIQ people, etc.
Okay, on that bright note, let's turn to something more active. What can people do? What actions can people take to fight back on attacks on GBV or any kind of I guess we covered kind of a wide range of things. What can we tell people to do?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's always a party when Amnesty shows up, right? Let us tell you about the terrible human rights state.
I'm talking about repro under the Trump administration, so every episode is pretty exciting.
Here's the good news. I think that, you know, the bad news is that we have an administration backed by a not insignificant number of people in the country who don't believe in human rights, who would erode, like, basic governance, who don't believe in equal protections for LGBTI people, who believe that there is no such thing as gender, that biological sex is your destiny, like these things that we know are not true, and that we value differently. And that's the bad news. The good news, and people are getting... Every day in the news, you're seeing that, right? So that's the bad news. We're not breaking any stories here. But the good news is that we can do something about that. And I use the we very broadly, right? We, like you and I sitting in D.C., can do something about that. We might need more wine to get through the day. But, like, we can do something about that. So for advocates, for people who work in advocacy, you know, I think one of the most important things we can do is make sure that we are, like, looking at our advocacy and our issues holistically. Our focus might be violence against women and girls. It might be girls' education. It might be environmental access. Whatever those things are, like, have that. That is your focus. That is your work. That is your work stream. But are you looking at that holistically? Are you understanding? Is it fully gender integrated? Is it fully racial justice integrated? Is it full? Like, have you really thought about the way this connects with other things, and the opportunities that opens up for you, and the ways that we need to support each other? I think that's one of the most critical lessons that certainly I've been learning day in day again here in the last. Has it only been a year?
Yeah.
The last year is, you know, the paraphrase Ben Franklin, if we don't hang together, right, we will all hang separately. And so that, I think, is one of the most critical lessons over the last year for advocates who do this professionally, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is we have to work together.
And we have to be better at talking
We
together
have to be better at talking
with everybody.
together. And I think as advocates, too, we also have to be strategic. And that is not always, I think particularly for people who care so deeply, which again is oftentimes why people get into this field. If people have other motivations, I'd love to hear them. But like, you know, that we care so deeply that we're just ready to go. And really we need to be strategic, like think about why and how we respond in ways that we do, not just for the sake of doing them, but to actually achieve a certain goal, to really move us forward or save as much ground as we can, whatever that goal is, right? And there will be disagreement in the community, and that's fine. Like we come from different orgs, we come from different perspectives. We as individuals care about different things and have very different views on certain, you know, certain issues. But so those I think are really critical for advocates. If you are lucky enough to not live in DC or New York in the advocacy world, and you know, this is not your bread and butter. You know, there's so many things, and I think that in the United States, particularly like reaching out to, and we hear this so many times, and it could not be more true. Like, make sure your elected officials know who you are and that you are contacting them about what you care about. So if you are in the United States and you care about something, like your elected officials and their staff need to know, and you can call them. Like, it is so easy. Like, you can call them, you can email them if you don't like to call people, you can tweet at them, although as our report will reveal on March 21st, it's a sort of vile cesspool. But, you know, there's so many ways to reach out and make sure that your representatives are actually representing your human rights values. That's just one way, right? And that's the sort of like elected democracy way to go about it. I think the other thing is, like, in our daily lives, are we doing the things we believe in, right? Are we, you know, here in DC, do people know they're welcome? Are people protected from ICE raids? Do women and girls know where to get resources? Do LGBTIQ folk know where they can get resources? And so committing yourself to that local work, because the world can seem so big, and the world is big, and there are so many human rights problems, particularly in this administration. Like, there are ways to localize this too. Like, always contact your representatives on global human rights issues. Like, I would be remiss as a human rights global org to say that, but also like in your communities, like, absolutely, what is happening so that real people can get real resources, and where do you think that you have a value add, right? And that doesn't mean like throw away your career and start over, but like, or like you have to give all the money that you were saving for your house payment. But it does mean thinking about the way that like real people live these human rights violations. Because the reason we care about human rights is not because of documents. I mean, that can be exciting for the nerds in us who love, you know, rule of law, but so for all you lawyers out there. But the reason is because, like, human rights mean people can live lives of dignity. And ultimately, like, that's what human rights are for, is to make sure that people can live lives of dignity, and that we can all lead regular lives of regular dignity, and that we are free from the fear of violence, we're free from the fear of these attacks. And so whatever that means in your own community, like, there's so many options, right? There's just so many things you can do. But of course the first thing you should do is call your representatives and say, I care about X thing. I mean, for gender-based violence specifically, you know, the International Violence Against Women Act is one piece of that, and that's a bill in House and Congress that would commit the United States government to prioritizing gender-based violence through a position in the State Department and through a gender-based violence strategy. And that's one piece of that work. And so folks can 100% and should call their senators and their congressperson. If you live in the District of Columbia or in Guam or in other non-voting places, you should reach out to your voting friends who have representation, voting representation.
That's what I
Shout
do.
out Puerto Rico, who have voting representation, right? So I mean, there's so many things, and I think that it is. These conversations are always so dark, but because there are so many challenges to human rights right now, and there is so much more resistance, and that looks like a ton of things, right? And that is. For us in DC, it's marching a lot because there's a lot of protests here. Yes. But, you know, my folks live in a very, very small town in northern rural California. And there are opportunities there all the time. And whether it's a march and showing your resistance, showing your community support, whether it's contacting your congressperson or your senators, whether it is ensuring that local shelters have resources, whether it's getting involved in something you didn't know, whether it's, you know, making sure your house of worship is inclusive, whatever that looks like for you, whatever the human right is that you care about, or the people that you see that are suffering, like there's ways to be involved. And so the silver lining to that is that there is so much more opportunity, and no one should feel helpless in this, right?
Right.
Exhausted, sure. Like there's a lot, but not helpless, because there are so many opportunities. I think the worst thing that this sort of onslaught of human rights abuses and attacks could do is to wear us down and divide us. And again, Amnesty has seen that in other countries, and it's an easy road to go down where it is exhausting. And at some point you're like, you know what, I'm just going to focus on this because it's the one thing that really speaks to me. And so then we divide ourselves, and making sure that we don't allow this administration, particularly any administration that attacks human rights, to divide us as communities of advocates, to divide us as people who care about each other. I mean, that's central. There are so many opportunities. Yeah, certainly call your congresspeople, support the International Violence Against Women Act, get involved, get involved locally, but don't give up. Don't be discouraged. Like, keep resisting an anti-human rights agenda.
Absolutely. And that is the perfect place to end it. Thank you, Tara, so much for being here. I'll make sure to link to Amnesty's new Human Rights Report on our show notes page, and anything else that we talked about, we'll make sure to have links so that people can get access. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much.
For more information, including show notes from this episode and previous episodes, please visit our website at reprosfightback.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at reprosfightback. If you like our show, please help others find it by sharing it with your friends and subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on iTunes. Thanks for listening.